last episode, the emperor arrived in Britain to celebrate his conquest, in quotes, of Britain, in quotes, although at that point I'm not sure they called it Britain, with the idea that he was accepting the surrender of several different kings and chieftains in order to show that he had won his great victory, that he was going to very soon celebrate as a triumph in Rome to show his military prowess and the victories that he had achieved. This, of course, is not factual. He conquested, if you want to call what Claudius did conquesting, a very specific area from about London into Kent. It's a very narrow region. Most of the fighting had been effectively in that area, and there wasn't really an expansion beyond that yet. That's about to change, and that's the subject of this particular podcast episode. While Claudius left, the legions were not idle. Claudius, who was, of course, the real general of the whole thing, organized the province's military expansion. Obviously, that's what they do. Different legions were deployed in different directions in order to accomplish this. The most vivid accounts of this phase come from Suetonius in the life of Vespasian. He tells us that Vespasian, commanding the 2nd Legion Augusta, one that's very famous in Wales, actually, fought 30 battles and subdued 2 powerful nations, and captured more than 20 oppida, including the Isle of Vectis, which is the Isle of Wight. And those 2 powerful nations are generally identified as the Duroges from Dorset and Somerset, and the Demoni of Devon and Cornwall. So, in other words, Vespasian's military went southwest, and that was their target. They were basically marching along the coast, claiming areas as they went. The Rhodoriges present one of the most archaeological visible aspects of the entire conquest of Britain. This was a tribe whose power was expressed through the hill forts, not the relatively modest defended enclosures of some other groups. This tribe had some of the most formidable hill forts in Britain. Maiden Castle near Dorchester is the most famous. Hod Hill in Dorset is another. Ham Hill in Somerset is the third. These were massive structures with multiple ramparts, deep ditches, and defended gateways. They were, in effect, kind of a fort, like a medieval castle, village, town, that kind of idea. Surrounded, protected, and generally populated. And, of course, the Romans had to take them. The Romans needed them in order to be able to conquer those areas, and they needed to be able to mount an effective offense against them. Of course, the Romans are well-traveled and well-learned in this process. They will, in only a few years from now, use that same tactic when dealing with Judea, and in conquering the Jews, they used a lot of the similar tactics, including how they eventually would attack Masada, building gigantic ramps up the mountain in order to carry out their attack. Maiden Castle, not quite a Masada, but still is an extraordinary place. Its defenses cover an area roughly 19 hectares and enclosed within a series of ramparts. At its eastern and western entrances, the approach routes were deliberately complicated with additional earthworks to channel attackers into killing grounds covered by defenders. Excavations at Maiden Castle in the 1930s by the archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler produced dramatic evidence of the Roman assault. Wheeler found a war cemetery near the eastern gate containing remains of dozens of individuals, many showing signs of violent deaths. Iron ballista bolts, the ammunition of the Roman artillery crossbows, were found embedded into the bones of some of the individuals. Wheeler himself described the scene with a vividness that has never quite been surpassed. Writing in his excavation report, he painted a picture of defenders cut down at the gate, some with Roman bolts still lodged into their vertebrae, hastily buried by survivors who had placed joints of lamb beside the bodies, in accordance to the old rites before the Romans sealed the site. Whether every detail of the reconstruction holds up to modern scrutiny, the image of those burials, the quick, frightened graves of people who had just lost everything, is one that of course stays with you. It's one that resonates for us even today. This was a battle. It was a vicious battle. This was not some, bring in our culture and let's have an exchange and trade. That stuff is over now. We're now on the conquest trail. And so it's all about taking land and taking control. And these are the kind of things that the Romans were good at and they were willing to do quite consistently. More recent reanalysis of Wheeler's findings have refined the picture, of course. The date of the cemetery and the number of individuals have been debated. Some scholars question whether the cemetery represents the Roman attack directly or a broader period of conflict, but the presence of Roman ballista bolts and human remains at this particular hill fort, in a context that really does date in the right period, remains one of the most powerful pieces of physical evidence for the reality of the Roman military conquest. In other words, it's hard to get past the evidence of our eyes and the evidence of the dates. And so while people are always kind of trying to say, well, it could be this, it could be that, there's a lot of hard facts that kind of bump up against that. Does it mean it happened the way Wheeler describes? Possibly not. But the reality of it is this is a castle fort, a hill fort that was dominant in the landscape, and it was important for the Romans to take it, and take it they did, and it was not done with friendly calmness and agreement. It was done through violence and aggression. The attack on Maiden Castle almost certainly involved artillery preparation. Roman field artillery, specifically the ballista, was a precision weapon, capable of projecting heavy bolts with considerable accuracy over significant distances against defenders crowded behind earthworks, ramparts, and other sort of defenses. Artillery could suppress movement, break up concentration of warriors, and create gaps in the defense that the assault infantry could exploit. You can imagine that as those things are hitting, it's terrifying, especially for people that aren't used to this. This is not weaponry that was used in Britain to this point. It was certainly a whole different way of fighting. The Roman methods were very different comparatively in the ancient world. So it would be in its own way and its own ideal, a much more brutal way of fighting. Now, that doesn't mean that the Britons didn't have their own brutal ways of fighting. There's lots of evidence that they themselves took no quarter. In some cases, in the more ancient times, there's evidence of cannibalism. So there isn't a lot of, I think it's very easy to fall into this mistake, to be blunt, that humans aren't humans. Humans do things. Humans are very similar. And while, yes, there are people who are peaceful and loving of their surroundings and the wilderness and other people, the reality of it is that's not generally everybody. And in a period where might often makes right, it's almost never the case. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind, just because, there is a tendency, even amongst the Romans themselves, as we'll talk about later, to kind of give this idea that people who are living a different kind of lifestyle that's more simplistic according to the rules and reasons of the so-called more civilized, doesn't mean that they were different than humans. They were still humans at the end of the day. They still did human things, and they still acted in a very human fashion. To not believe that is to not accept their humanness. It's to other them in a way that makes no sense. We're not the Romans. We don't need to other Britons any more than we need to other anybody else. The reality of it is they probably reacted in the exact same way most humans do. And up against a implacable force that, at least at this point, nobody had familiarity with and nobody really understood how to defeat, you can see why it becomes a terrifying situation. And the reason why, for some, making alliances made more sense than making resistance, while others were very willing to resist everything in the process because they were trying to preserve their own ways of life. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the Welsh context very soon. And of course, you have to understand the scene. The Second Legion is drawing up outside this great eastern entrance. Their ballistae are in place at a higher ground to cover the approach. Artillery fire then would begin. Bolts crack into the timber palisades on the top of the ramparts. Defenders who expose themselves to shoot back find themselves targeted. Assault infantry advance up a carefully channeled approach. Shields locked against the missile fire. Keep in mind that normally, if you've got a funneling system, you want to be in above them to attack down, because typically people are vulnerable. While in the Roman system and the way they protected themselves, one of the methods they used was something called a turtle armor, which effectively is when they would have the front of the troops hold their shields on the straight like that, but then you would have everybody else with their shields above them, except for the back, where they'd be doing something similar at the back. And so in effect, it creates almost an armor around them. So it makes it much more difficult to hit them with projectiles and other weapons. It's not like, a grouping of people just running up a hill. These are very formulaic ways of attacking. And they did work. And they did because they were able to project and understand how the other side attacked. So that's something to keep in mind. And of course, the assault infantry were not exactly fools. They knew what was coming. And so they marched as quickly as possible with their shields locked as these missile fire came in, pressing towards the gate to avoid more fires and to push through as hard as they could. The defenders, of course, fought. Bones at Maiden Castle obviously are a silent testimony to that, but the Romans broke through, as we knew they would in the story. Excavations at this Dorset hill fort in the 50s found a concentration of a Roman ballista bolt in areas of what appears to have been the chieftain's compound within the hill fort. The pattern of bolt distribution suggests targeted fire rather than suppressive barrage. So in other words, they knew where the leadership were, they knew where the large proportion of troops were, and that's where they were firing. This, of course, is an intriguing idea that the Romans appear to have specifically targeted the leadership compound at Hod Hill rather than simply bombarding the defenses broadly. If this interpretation is correct, which again with archaeology we can never fully know, but we make some educated guesses to some extent, then it suggests a deliberate strategy of decapitation, literally and figuratively removing the leadership of the resistance. Something that for some groups would have been crushing. If you lose the leader of the army or the leader of the people, that's enough to finish them off without having to lose a lot of people in the process of the fight. Keep in mind, the Romans aren't stupid. They're not, a machine. They are themselves, going back to the human aspect of things, they don't want to die either. So for them, it's more about how can we win this battle with the least loss of life? And understanding that that's not going to be in a modern sense. It's going to be very much around, can we lose 100 instead of 1,000 kind of calculation. So if you can decapitate them, at the very least, you sow confusion in the ranks, because without the leadership sort of telling you where to go, it's a little bit more difficult to respond to things. It creates a level of, well, who's in charge? And all of that creates more and more confusion. So that would be part of it, as well as the fact that maybe with some groups, they would literally kill the entire resistance. The subsequent Roman actions at Hod Hill is particularly revealing. After the hill fort was taken, the Romans didn't simply demolish it and move on. They built a small auxiliary fort on the northwest corner of the existing hill fort. The Roman fort at Hod Hill still sits there. Its square outline with round corners, the classic playing card shape of Roman auxiliary installations, is visible within the much larger oval of the Iron Age hill fort. It is one of the best preserved examples in Britain of one of the clearest physical statements of what the Roman conquest actually meant in practice. The defeated community was disarmed and controlled. The Romans built inside the defeated place literally occupying the space of the conquered, and likely did it with relatively small casualties because, very simply, I suspect if they did hit the leadership, things just collapsed. Richard Hingeley, in his work on Roman imperialism and its landscapes, described sites like Hod Hill as physical arguments. The Roman fort inside the Iron Age hill fort was not just practical. It was a statement made in earth and timber that said, "Your world is now contained within ours." Every person living in the shadow of that Roman fort understood without needing to be told what had changed. So that's kind of the battle down into the southwest. Now we're going to turn south and talk about the Isle of Wight. Suetonius specifically mentions the Isle of Vectis, which is, of course, the name for the Isle of Wight, as one of Vespasian's conquests. The island would have required a short sea crossing in addition to the land campaign. Keep in mind that the land and geography of Britain at this time is slightly different than it is now. There's more swamp, there's less understood boundaries between the sea and the land in some spots versus what there is now, simply because we've gone through and drained swamps to try and make better building and construction. So you have this tendency for areas that were lodged in even the Middle Ages as being a swampy mass, now being effectively just a normal part of the rest of Britain. And so what may have been a gap that's much smaller in modern times is much wider, possibly at this point. It really depends on how everything worked out. Sometimes it's the other way around, but that's kind of the way I would describe this to understand that the Isle of Britain that we know of now is not the island of Britain in this period. That's just something to keep in mind. Its inclusion, or the inclusion of Isle of Wight in this list, suggests that the Second Legion's operations were not simply a land march through Dorset and Somerset, but also involved naval support and offshore operations. The Classis Britannia, the Roman British fleet, would have been essential for this operation. The island, separated from the mainland by the Salient, was a distinct territory whose submission had to be separately achieved. The details reinforce the impression of a systemic and methodological campaign rather than a single dramatic advance. The number of 20 oppida is listed by Suetonius, and it has fascinated and frustrated scholars for generations. Archaeologists have spent decades trying to identify which specific sites correspond to Vespasian's campaign. Maiden Castle is an obvious candidate, as is Hod Hill. Ham Hill in Somerset, Spetsbury Rings and the Bradbury Rings, as well as South Cadbury and Hembury in Devon, are also sites that we can say for sure match up with some of the evidence of these particular oppidas. Most of these show some evidence of late Iron Age activity, in some cases evidence of Roman period disruption or transition, depending on the case, but positive identification of a specific site as one of Vespasian's 20 oppida is rarely straightforward. The number 20 is probably an approximate in any case, or it may have been a case of making up a number, because quite often if the numbers didn't work the way the writer wanted them to, they might sketch them a little bit, shall we say, either expanding or contracting, depending on what they're trying to accomplish. And of course, the word oppida covers a range of settlement types, which is part of the problem. What Suetonius is conveying, however, is not a precise operational list, but rather a general sense of the scale and success of the campaign. It's like saying, they took over Germany by taking over 7 or 8 major centers, but the story could be quite a bit about, hey, there's this little village that resisted for a long, long time that you don't know about that actually makes a big difference in the war, but because it's not a major spot that people back in Rome have any clue about, they may not mention. And to be fair, probably most people in Britain, or most people in Rome, didn't know anything about Britain, so you could make up names if you really wanted to. I mean, in the period Suetonius is writing, maybe Londinium is maybe the only one, or possibly Colchester. are kind of the big names that maybe people would know. The fall of Caledodunum and submission of the 11 kings did not end resistance, as we said. Caractacus had not submitted, he had not been captured, and he had not been killed like his brother Tognodamus. Instead, he retreated westward, and in that retreat, he was making a choice which would have consequences for years and ultimately for the entire history of the Roman province. So, who is Caractacus? He was the son of, as we mentioned last episode, Canobelinus. He had been a joint leader in the British resistance in 43 CE alongside his brother, but after the death of his brother, he became the single most important figure in the continuing resistance, at least from the perspective of the writers that we have evidence of. I want to continue to point that out just in case, because obviously just because he's the name that the Romans know doesn't mean he is actually the leader of this resistance movement, but he just happens to be the name that's very familiar. And maybe those historians are basically like, well, everybody knows who this dude is. Nobody knows who this dude is. So we're going to point out this dude specifically. It's hard. That part of it, I'm not sure. Tacitus gives us the most detailed portrait of Caractacus, which makes sense. Tacitus is the closest to it, even though he's writing almost 50 years after the fact. He's still our closest source. Though, of course, it comes from accounts of later campaigns rather than the invasion period itself. He emerges from Tacitus's account as a leader of genuine military skill, personal courage, and considerable political intelligence. He was able to maintain resistance for years after the initial conquest, shifting from tribe to tribe as circumstances required, raising new forces, and adapting his tactics to the conditions that he faced. He was also, in Tacitus's telling, eloquent and aware of his own place in the larger story. When he was finally brought to Rome as a prisoner years later, Tacitus records a speech in which Caractacus addresses Claudius directly, arguing that his resistance had made Claudius's glory greater. This is likely made up. It is a speech, of course, composed by Tacitus rather than a verbatim record, but the sentiment it expresses is still historically credible because without it, Claudius doesn't become this almighty conqueror that he wants to be perceived as. The speech, as Tacitus gives it, contains one passage that's worth hearing, even in translation. Caractacus tells Claudius, quote, "If you want to rule the world, does it follow that everyone else welcomes enslavement?" End quote. It is a line that Tacitus would have put in the mouth of any defeated leader, but he chose to put it in the mouth of a Briton. That choice tells us something about how Rome, at its most reflective, understood what it was doing. He will use this kind of verbiage again, and we're going to talk about it a lot when it comes to the battles with Boudica and the Silures. There's very much this sense of the idea of to use a very 1800s term, novel savage about the Britons in Tacitus's writings. So we have to understand that he's not looking at it as like, these are great people. They're just barbarians that happen to be noble because they remember the old ways and live up to them. But in reality, they're still barbarians when it comes down to it. That's really, it's more of an ideal than it is the reality. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind. That's still a level of what we would call now racism about the way Tacitus writes. So keep that in mind. So as we have now discussed a lot of the Southern campaign, there is one aspect we've now ignored, and that is in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, Caractacus moved into the territory of the Silures from South Wales. Silures were not a random choice. The Silures were a tribe that Tacitus would later describe as a swarthy, curly-haired, short group that were resistant to Roman governance. Their terrain was hostile to Roman operations. Their social structure was decentralized and resilient, and they were ideally placed to provide ongoing support the continued resistance movement. Now, before we move into other tribes, it's important to understand the Silures are basically in southeastern Wales. There may be more elsewhere in other parts of Wales and maybe into the southwest of England, but the large majority of them in the historical record and in the archaeological evidence shows that they were pretty much in and around the south valleys, especially around Caerleon, because that's one of the reasons why Caerleon is where it is, or the legionary fort. It is because they are such a problem, and they will be a problem for a very long time compared to the rest of what becomes the Roman province of Britain. Now, along with them is the other problem, which is the Ordovices of North Wales, who would resist Roman authority for years themselves. Their territory was even more difficult because, of course, we're now talking Central and North Wales, and you can imagine how much more difficult it is and will be for many centuries to come. In 43 CE, these tribes were not directly engaged with the Roman advance, but the presence of Caractacus amongst the Silures was a statement of intent. The war was not over simply because the southeast and, I guess, the southwest had submitted. Claudius, as first governor, was well aware of this. The consolidation of the province would require years more of campaigning and a permanent military presence along what would then become the western frontier of the Roman Britain, and eventually the northern part as well. So, what had Rome actually won? In the immediate aftermath of the Claudian campaign, Rome had a province, but it was a province of an uncertain extent and contested borders. We think it stretches from the end of Cornwall over to Kent and slightly north of London, but that's just kind of a guess based on where they describe the battles going on. Could the Romans have been more north? Yes. Could they have been more south than we think? Could the conquest of Cornwall and Devon be kind of we came, we saw, we left kind of thing? Or is it an actual formal setup of control? We're not fundamentally sure. And the lands of the Catilaveni and the Trinovantes, now with Calalodunum, are the initial administrative centers of this province. The territories of the Artabetes and the Regni in the south, whose leadership had accepted or embraced Roman authority because of their trade links and all the other things that they were already well into the midst of Roman control. These coastal lands of Kent were where the army landed, and thus an area that is very much under Roman control. Beyond this zone, so this very specific area, Roman authority existed in theory, but needed to be established in practice, and the process would, of course, take decades. Amongst all these things, you have the submission of the 11 kings at Calalodunum, or chieftains, who knows. And these did not simply turn their territories into directly governed Roman provinces overnight. Some of these were certainly confirmed as client rulers and client kingdoms, which allowed them to continue to govern their territories under Roman oversight, very similar to what had been happening in the eastern half of the Roman Empire for quite a number of years. Judea was one of those at one time. The relationship, however, between Rome and its client kings was well established, but it was also not always permanent. Of course, they were cheaper than direct occupation, and maintaining local stability was easier under these circumstances, but it also provided time for the Romanization to take root and for the exchange of culture to take root, because you make it more convenient to link these two together so that eventually, when you decide to take that kingdom out and it becomes the part of the province, it's a lot simpler to do. The best documented example from this period is Cogidumnus, sometimes spelled as Togodumnus, which appears in an inscription found in Chichester in Sussex. This inscription describes him as a great king of the Britons and records his loyalty to Rome. Tacitus mentions him as an example of Rome's practice of using kings as instruments of servitude. Cogidumnus may have ruled an enlarged territory in the south, incorporating the former Atrebatic lands. The extraordinarily impressive palace complex at Fishbourne near Chichester, the largest Roman building north of the Alps in its early phase, had been associated with him by some scholars, though the connection remains debatable. Whatever his exact territory and titles, Cogidumnus represents something important. The Claudian invasion created not just Roman province in the east, but also a belt of client states in the south that provided both a buffer and a demonstration of the success of Roman patronage. One of the clearest physical examples of the Roman conquest is the roads. Within years of the invasion, Roman engineers were building roads across the new province, not tentative tracks, but engineered highways, surveyed, drained, metalled, and built to last. Watting Street, running from the coast through what would become London on to the Midlands, was amongst the earliest. Stane Street, connecting London to Chichester through the territory of Cogidumnus, is another early example. The Fosse Way, running diagonally across Britain from Exeter in the southwest to Lincoln and to the northeast, is often described as the original frontier road of the Claudian province, marking the outer edge of the effective control in the first phase of occupation. Roads were not simply transport infrastructure. They were statements of power. They connected military installations and enabled rapid troop movements. They carried the traffic of imperial administration and physically imposed a new geometry on the landscape. The straight Roman road cutting across older fields and boundaries and tribal territories was mostly visible and were daily reminders that the world had changed. Martin Millet, whose work on the Romanizing of Britain remains influential, argued that Roman roads should be understood as an instrument of administrative integration as much as military logistics. They allowed the governor to govern, the tax collector to collect, and the merchant to trade. In a landscape previously defined by paths and seasonal tracks, the engineered road announced the arrival of a state that intended to stay. Within a few years of the conquest, Camulodunum was transformed. The legionary fortress was dismantled, and the site was redeveloped as a colonia, a settlement of Roman veterans. This was not simply a practical measure to house retired soldiers. A colonia was a legal and political statement. It was a piece of Rome planted in Britain. Settlers, of course, were Roman citizens. They brought with them Roman law, Roman religion practice, and architectural conventions from Rome. They built a forum, they built a temple, they built a bathhouse. The pre-existing British population of the Oppidum was displaced or absorbed. Tacitus later records that Britons hated Caledonium. He describes the colony as a stronghold of tyranny in the British eyes. That's his words. Keep in mind, this is his words. He describes its veterans as aggressive in seizing land and expelling families that had lived there for generations. When Boudicca's revolt erupted in 60 or 61 CE, Caledonium was its first target, which goes to speak to the idea that they hated it. Tacitus is specific about why. He tells us that veterans drove Britons from their homes, ejected them from their fields, called them captives and slaves. The temple of Claudius, which the Romans had built as a monument to the divine emperor, was in British eyes, as Tacitus puts it, a citadel of everlasting oppression. These were not abstract grievances. They were grievances of people who had lost their lands and watched a monument to their conqueror arise on them. The colony was not just a success story for the Romanization, it was also a grievance. Understanding that helps explain why the revolt, when it came, was particularly violent. The Claudian invasion gave Rome a new province and a Claudian and Claudius a triumph. In the immediate sense, both of those things mattered enormously. The province was a symbol as much as a territory. Britain, the island at the edge of the world, had been brought within the Roman order. The ocean had been crossed. Caesar's unfinished business was now finished. For Claudius personally, the campaign achieved exactly what it needed to. He had come to the throne without military credentials and under deep, uncertain circumstances. The British triumph gave him an unassailable achievement. No one could question that the emperor had conquered Britain, was a legitimate ruler. But Rome was also acquiring real responsibility. A province required a garrison required supply. Supply required infrastructure. Infrastructure required labor and money. The province of Britannia would never be the most profitable in the empire. Its climate, its distinction from the Mediterranean, and its persistent cost with a military frontier made it an expensive possession. Roman writers occasionally questioned whether Britain was worth the cost. The debate appears in Strabo before the invasion, but would reappear in various forms throughout the Roman period. But once committed, Rome did not withdraw. That would have been seen as a failure, and as no emperor would want to be the one who failed, this was an impossible idea to contemplate. Of course, for the British tribes who had submitted, life changed immediately and profoundly. Taxation arrived, at least the Roman form of it. Rome conducted censuses to establish the basis for tribute. Property was assessed, obligation was imposed, and for elites who had been trading with Rome and using Roman goods for prestige, some of this was familiar in form, if not in scale. But for ordinary farming communities who had never had to pay a formal tribute, or at least not to this way, it was something that they could not have imagined before this. Roman taxation was an entirely new burden. Roman law began to operate alongside all this, and in some areas instead of this. Local customs, property rights, inheritance, contracts, and criminal matters increasingly came within the Roman legal system rather than local tribal practice. Soldiers appeared, Roman forts went up across the new province, and the sights and sounds of the legionaries on the move, the smell of the Roman camp, the evidence of Roman engineering became a part of daily life for communities near these new military installations. For some, this was opportunity. Traders, craftspeople, suppliers could meet Roman needs and found new markets. Elites, especially local elites who aligned with Roman power, could gain status, protection, and potentially Roman citizenship over time. For others, of course, it was a loss. Land was taken for the colony at Caledonum. Local leaders who had based their authority on independence found that authority constrained now by Roman oversight. Sacred places, tribal customs, and the way of life that had existed for generations, millennia, suddenly found themselves in tension with Roman expectations. The revolt of Boudica 17 years later was not an accident. It grew directly from the specific tensions and injustices of Roman rule in the new province. The seeds of that revolt were planted in the years immediately after 43 CE. Dave Mattingly put the longer view with incomparable clarity. Roman Britain, he wrote, was a place where some people thrived and many others did not. The winners were the elite who could navigate the new system. The losers, as often is the case, was the ordinary communities whose lands, labor, and resources were absorbed into the imperial economy that had no particular interest for their well-being. The conquest of 43 CE created both of these. And it would be pretty much a millennia before it happened again with the if you want to make the argument, I guess, with the Anglo-Saxons, you could make that argument 400 years after this. But it really shows strongly in evidence with the Normans. For Caractacus and the tribes of the west and the north, 43 CE was the beginning, not an end. Caractacus would fight for 9 more years. We're going to go into him and a lot of what went on later. His final defeat in 51 CE. But he would move between tribes, maintain coalitions, adapt his tactics, and keep the flame of resistance alive in many ways that made him a genuine strategic problem for Rome for nearly a decade. The Silures would resist Roman authority for years after even Caractacus was gone. The Ordovires would require Agricola's campaign in the late 70 CE to finally break their organized resistance. The north of the island, everything beyond the Trent and Humber, remained almost entirely outside Roman control in 43 CE. Brigantes would be managed through their client queen, Cartimandua, for decades before that relationship collapsed and the Roman military attention had to be turned northward. Scotland, of course, was never ever fully conquered. The frontier would eventually be drawn at Hadrian's Wall and briefly pushed northward to the Antonine Wall, but the Northern Highlands remained beyond Roman control for the entire period of occupation. 43 CE was therefore not a conquest of Britain, it was a conquest of a part of Britain, and even that part would remain contested, costly, and complex for the full 400 years of Roman rule. The Romans who landed in Britain were crossed into a world in which they only knew from texts and traders. The Britons who watched them come were facing a power unlike their island had ever encountered before. What happened in that spring and summer was extraordinary. The army of perhaps 50,000 men crossing the sea fought 2 major river battles, advanced across southern Britain, and within a few months had received the formal submission of a significant portion of the island's tribal leadership. By any measure of ancient military history, this was a remarkable achievement. Claudius had planned well. His commanders, Vespasian amongst them, had fought with skill and determination. The army performed with the discipline and adaptability that made the Roman military the most formidable force in the Western world. But it was not simply a Roman achievement. It was also shaped by the decisions of the British leaders who submitted, and by the rivalries between tribes that Rome had been able to exploit, and by the specific political needs of one anxious emperor who needed to show that he deserved the throne. The 11 kings who came to Caledonum and lowered their heads were making a calculation, not simply capitulating. Some of these calculations would prove to be correct. Others would not. And Caractacus, somewhere in the west, was making a different calculation entirely. In the next episode, we will follow the early years of the province. We'll look at what Rome built, what it destroyed, and we'll meet many of the conflicting figures that will battle them over the next decade and a half. This will, of course, be an era of violence and of destruction, but yet of building, of creation of something far bigger than we expected at that time, I'm sure, but yet something that had a lasting influence on the landscape and on the people of Britain. Thank you for listening. Thank you for viewing. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on social media at Welsh History Pod on almost every social media site except for Facebook, where it's facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Keep in mind, if you have a business concern or you want to talk to me about, something to do with the production, please reach out to me on email. Don't go through my social media. I won't typically respond to those, as an example. However, if you would like to help the podcast out through financing our research and the work we do and the travel that we're making, please do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again. Enjoy your day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.